So our next panel is digital security, avoiding a failure of imagination. After 9/11, that's what the commission said was our biggest failure. It was a failure to imagine and understand the nature of the security threat that we faced. And since 9/11, we've seen major changes in our security and surveillance policies. And as technology continues to develop, there's a constant challenge. How can we give our law enforcement, our national security agencies, the tools they need to protect us from harm without compromising the data security of our products and breaking encryption and things like that? So our panel is going to discuss these challenges, how we can ensure sensitive information we trust with companies is not put at risk in the name of national security, and how can we respond to those bad actors who exploit these tools for nefarious purposes. So without further ado, let's have our panel come out.
Hi, everybody. Nice to be here. My name's Katie Bowe-Williams. I'm the national security reporter for The Hill newspaper. We've got an interesting panel to kick off here. So I'm going to give a little bit of a rundown on what we're going to be talking about, and then I'll let these guys introduce themselves. It has been almost 16 years since 9/11, and the commission accused our leaders of not understanding the threat that we faced. Now we are grappling with a new and increasingly complex landscape that is born of an explosion of new technology platforms, connected devices, and big data. As the Internet of Things becomes increasingly interwoven in our daily lives, policymakers are going to have to balance a host of legal and technological concerns to ensure that we safeguard not just the digital security of individuals, but of the nation as a whole. So we've got a great panel here today to discuss the best way to approach these challenges going forward, and I'm going to let these guys introduce themselves. If you want to start over here with you, Harley.
Hi, everyone. I'm Harley Geiger, and I am Director of Public Policy at Rapid7. Rapid7 is a cybersecurity and IT analytics firm. We've got a headcount of about 1,000, and we're in offices around the world. I've also been a Hill staffer and a counsel at a think tank here in Washington, D.C., and I've worked in cybersecurity and surveillance policy for about 8 years.
Right on. My name is Alex Kryolan. I'm a managing partner of SecureSet Accelerator. We run an investment capital fund that funds cybersecurity startups. We're based in Denver, Colorado. I used to be a Hill staffer, then moved on to Homeland Security, and was a guest researcher at National Institutes of Standards and Technology. Done some fun stuff like speak at DEF CON, which is cool. People should be there. You should also be here. And you know, run a firm in Denver that previously one of the things that we did was also focus on cybersecurity education through our brand SecureSet. And we can talk maybe more about some of the critical issues around humans in security as well.
Great. I'm Richard Sierson, not a policy guy, a security guy. I work for a little company called Twilio, about 1,000 people as well. What distinguishes Twilio is we're a completely post infrastructure. Other than my laptop and the gummy bears they give me, we don't have any hardware or anything. We have about 1.6 million developers who use our APIs to be expressive and powerful in embedding communications into a multitude of devices, be it video, text, messaging, what have you, voice. Before that, I was the general manager and vice president of cybersecurity and privacy for GE Healthcare. As you may know, GE Healthcare, we're in about every country making things you put your body into and things you put into your body. And I was brought in when they decided that the cloud was cool and we should make that all talk to the cloud. Prior to that, I was at Kaiser Permanente, leading security there. Kaiser is a massive healthcare provider, insurer, and you've heard of them, yes, yes. Yeah. And prior to that, lots of other security stuff as actually working for various security firms, venture capital-backed security firms making products. Also an author, have a book that's published called How to Measure Anything in Cybersecurity Risk. Someone you might know wrote the foreword to it, Dan Geer. He's the CISO for In-Q-Tel. In-Q-Tel is an investment arm for the NSA, FBI, and CIA. So that's about my strongest connection to the Hill, Dan. He looks like Neil Young. He's got like mutton chops out to here.
They're awesome.
Yeah. I endorse that strongly. Yeah. Well, we've got a lot of stuff to cover, so I'm going to jump right in, guys. And I'll let whoever wants to grab this one go. There seems to be a real a general lack of clarity in DC as to what the threat environment actually looks like, what different parts of the security ecosystem contribute to mitigating threats, and how rapidly attacks change while simpler attacks stay the same. So I'm hoping you guys can talk to me a little bit about what concerns you think are overblown and which ones you see as underappreciated. Who wants to tackle that one?
So DC, government agencies and different DC organizations are not homogenous, and so they each suffer from different problems, right? So some perceive risk differently than others. So it's kind of difficult to generalize, but I'll give you three examples. One is, and you alluded to this in the question, is the importance of just cyber hygiene. Most attacks are through known vulnerabilities. Sometimes there's perception, and it's often overblown in the media, that hackers are out there creating brand new and sophisticated exploits for particular targets, and that's not really the case. The vast majority of attacks are through known vulnerabilities, and often these can be solved through known means like patching. And so hygiene is actually incredibly important. And DC, right now there is despite, I know there may be disagreement about this, but there is a great deal of aversion to any kind of regulation. Mm-hmm. And I understand that. On the other hand, at some point, no regulation at all in the face of patches or things that can be applied to actually make very measurable differences in cybersecurity. But those measurable differences are not being achieved because the actions are not being taken. At what point does regulation actually become something that we need to consider? And other countries are actually already moving in that direction. So the United States is not; other countries are, and with them perhaps will go some of the industry. A second is IT modernization. And this is changing. This is getting a lot better in DC. But at some point, we need to recognize that we have to make a large expenditure in the federal government and in state governments to change our platforms, right? So having software and having vulnerability management techniques, those things are all very helpful, but we do need to change our legacy IT. And the federal government writ large suffers from a very old IT system. This is changing. The Trump administration, they had an executive order on cybersecurity where they talked about IT modernization and changing platforms. It's going to be a long process, and it will be an expensive process, but it is also one that I think is really necessary for cybersecurity. And then the last one, the third one is, and this too is getting better, but equating all hackers with evil. Right? I mean, hackers it's a very broad set. Some of them are white hat security researchers who are actually making the world a better place, and some of them are in fact malicious criminals. And part of the art of law must be to distinguish between the two.
I'd add a couple of other contexts. And by the way, that was awesome because it's really frustrating for especially myself. Like when I used to work in agencies, everything's always urgent. Everything's always the worst, and we're constantly under attack. And I'm incredibly frustrated because I see advanced persistent threat, or APT, as this buzzword that's constantly thrown around. And it's like there's this cabal of people that are sitting somewhere in China, and they're like all getting together and they're trying to create new vulnerabilities. And sure, that's fine, but I mean, we actually have an index of this. It's called the National Vulnerability Database. It's open, it's free. You can go on it and you can search any system and you can find out what's vulnerable. And when you do that, what you realize is there are two things that are true. The first is over a 10-year horizon, we have had an increase in low complexity and high severity vulnerabilities. This means we're doing a bad job, okay? The rate at which we've had this increase has been somewhat frustrating because it comes in parallel with some of the largest spends in IT security, which means that we're spending more money, but we're getting less return on our investment. And that has to be something we start addressing. I think the second context to this is that we constantly forget there's a human that feels the brunt of the attack, right? And it's not always so easy as just changing your credit card number, because that's just a proxy for your actual account number, right? If it's a healthcare record, it's your healthcare record. Your blood type's your blood type. Your genome is your genome, and that can't really be changed. But there's a social impact to cybersecurity that goes completely underrepresented. Let's have two people. We'll have one person who is a managing partner of a Washington, D.C.-based law firm, drives a Tesla, makes an enormous amount of money, to which the market allowed that, and that's a good thing. But the output becomes, because, it is back to the future policy. So the output, though, becomes this person has chase fraud prevention services, credit monitoring services, reporting services, his or her own attorneys. And then we have another person who's, single dad of two, and doesn't make any money, works at a steel factory, has no chase fraud prevention services because he uses a green dot card, doesn't have an attorney of their own to call, and has almost no recourse. But their identities are almost identical in terms of their worth on the black market. So they're equal targets for exploitation, but they're completely treated differently in the way that they're resolved and protected. And this is the actual problem. It's not that, you know, we're getting hacked. Yes, we are, but people are feeling the impact and they don't even know it. And their kids feel the impact, and then when they go to apply for a college loan in 15 years, they're bankrupt, and they didn't know that they were, because they were 3 at the time that their healthcare record got stolen. And that's the actual problem that we need to start focusing on.
I know, that was great too, by the way.
It's going to be very self-complimentary.
I'll be really...
Do you want me to tell you how great you guys are?
Thank you.
Thanks, Katie.
You did really well too. Okay, so really, really briefly on this. By the way, you know, security folks will drop security terms all the time. How many of you have actually heard the term before, APT, Advanced Persistent Threat? How many of you? Okay, well now all of you have heard it, so now you can all raise your hands when you hear that next time. There's a lot of definitions that go around about this particular type of threat. Typically it's a nation-state adversary that's got onto your network, cohabitating for a long period of time, ideally to exfiltrate regulated, restricted data, right? That's the idea. I have a better definition for APT for you, and you can tell everyone that you heard it here from me. APT means better than you. APT means better than you. So whatever you're dealing with, whatever the context is of your infrastructure, be it the federal government or be it a security firm like Rapid7, anything that's defeating you might as well be called an APT. So it might be an uninformative distinction. APT, now you know it, now you know everything. The thing that I would add to the topic, though, what I would want the federal government to think about, this is something that I want my employers to think about, is something I heard from Jeff Immelt, recent CEO of GE. He said to us, security folks, he said, please, be risk managers, not control freaks. Now, why is that important? Because you're dealing, particularly when it comes to securing your environment, you're dealing with a lot of legacy infrastructure. Well, think about GE. We make airplanes, we make choo-choo trains, we make nuclear reactors, we make things that suck up goo from the bottom of the ocean through tubes that go up a mile high to a big platform that's several acres, that's GPS controlled. It's a great business model because then they service those things for life. They're very, very old. So when you and these are investments that are critical. The availability of them, the things that they do to make the world turn are absolutely critical. So you have to manage risks. There's a variety of risks. It's not just the risks of being hacked. It's the risk of destroying an economy. So when we think about cybersecurity, and as you go about your day now thinking about cybersecurity, I'd encourage you to be risk managers, not control freaks. I might come back to that as we talk further.
Preach.
Well, I wanted to add that kind of leads me into a pretty neat little follow-up question there for you, Richard, which is how do you make cybersecurity measurable? If you are doing a risk analysis, how do you create that metric? What does that look like?
That's a seeded question for me because of my authorship. Thank you for that. You know, you mentioned ROI. You talked about ROI. He did that too to help me out because I'm the non-policy guy. Thank you. Return on investment. You'll hear this a lot, and you'll hear a lot of security folks say you can't measure risk that way. Well, guess what? You're going to be measured that way. You know, we're always dealing with a lack of resources. We're always under constraints, right? Particularly in the federal government. I just visited one of the senators and his staff. They said, oh, it'd be great. Why don't you guys come out to San Francisco and hang out? I'll show you around. And they said, oh, yeah, no travel budgets. And I said, oh, darn. Everyone's dealing with constraints. And so, again, going back to being risk managers, how do we go about measuring risk? So I'll give you another thing to go away with. I gave you one limerick. I will give you another one. Always ask yourself, this goes to measuring risk. What would I see occurring that would let me know that this, whatever, is working? So in terms of capability, let's say your capability is data privacy, right, or data security. You've developed a data security capability. What would you see occurring that would let you know this capability is working? That's an evidence-based question. By the way, this is kind of question a board member would ask you if you're to present to, like, my board. They'd say, well, how do I know that thing's working? What you wouldn't want to say is, here's my NIST 853 sticker. Here's my ISO 27001 sticker. Here's my PCI sticker. That's a form of third-party assurance. That's not evidence, right? We use evidence, empirical evidence, to update our beliefs about probable future loss. This is risk management, and this is the type of thing that I'll go on forever, so I'm going to stop now, but like drop mic, walk off stage. But this is the type of thinking that we need to have. Again, being risk managers, we have an uncertain future. We have much more uncertain technology. Again, we're getting to a post-infrastructure world. The bad guys have always been post-infrastructure. They've always been, they're sentient, right? And artificially intelligent adversaries have been operating digitally forever, highly uncertain, increasingly uncertain infrastructure. So again, we need to start looking at the evidence that we have, the telemetry we have to make better forecasts, to get better ROI.
And it's not a cost center. That's the other part, is like so many organizations, they view cybersecurity as a loss, right? Because it doesn't generate value. But there are metrics that you can put in place to insert evaluative criterion to determine if you are doing a good job or not. And you can use frameworks like the return on security investment framework, which is not like ROI, but it's a way to translate how technical wonks think about the world to oftentimes MBAs or attorneys or board members. And this becomes critical because I fundamentally don't believe that we know if what we're doing is effective, right? If we go back to this premise of when you look at the National Vulnerability Database and you see a sharp increase in low complexity but high severity vulnerabilities at the same time that we're spending a lot of money, that would indicate that you're very bad at your job, but you're very good at spending money, right? And that's not the metric that we want for people, right? I mean, that'd be a great metric to be judged on, I guess, if you had unlimited funds, but we don't. We all operate in constraints.
So I would defer to the guy that wrote the book on cybersecurity measurement, literally, but only to add that I think the way that you would measure cybersecurity effectiveness is going to vary by organization, right? So the person who's building an IoT device, or the company is building an IoT device, their measure of security should include the extent to which secure design is built into their device, and should include how often their device is hacked, how secure their device is, and that is a very different form of measurement than, say, a space like this, which has no doubt a Wi-Fi network. How often do they get breached, right? So their measurement will be very different from the person who's building a product, very different from the government agency who has thousands of employees to manage and so forth. So I think it's a complex area how to measure it, but it's measurable. You can write a book about it.
Oh yeah, one more thing I should mention. If this topic of measurement, quantitative measurement, doing forecast at large scale is of particular interest, then I do, and this is totally shameless, I do encourage you to look at our book. It's nice. It's also good for pressing flowers if you don't want to read it or you have sleep problems. But our literature represents 10% of the actuarial tests from our literature. So if you are an actuary or use actuaries and you're really interested in true risk management for cyber, it is required reading, and 10% of the questions on the test come from our literature. So it's fairly legit.
It's a really important area. I mean, cyber insurance is going to depend on it, and measurement is what they're working on right now to actually get the market up and running. And so it's critical.
Cyber insurance is a mathematically unambiguous way to measure your risk tolerance.
If it worked.
Well, sure it does. Sure. How could cyber insurance not work? If someone comes up to you with a bill and says, "Hey, look, you breached, you lost my PHI, you owe me $10 million. It fits within your exclusion of your policy." You go, "Okay, $10 million." That worked.
Yeah, but there's a couple of ways that it doesn't work. So the first way.
2 minutes to debate.
All right, awesome. All right, this will be great. So the first way that cybersecurity insurance doesn't work is because they don't actually have appropriate actuarial tables in a number of circumstances. And the second piece is that they don't tend to do particularly effective forensics. And because of this, they generally treat it as though you burn down your own store, which is why many cyber insurance policies never pay out. So it's a wonderful model because you're constantly paying into cybersecurity insurance, but they tend to try, at the very best, like every insurance organization, to not pay you back. But the other piece of it is now we've inserted this new cyber overlord, and I actually dropped the word cyber as a standalone, which I hate. But we have our new cyber overlords of people who are not technologists who are telling us how to manage risk, and we're listening to people who couldn't get a RDP shell up if they needed to save the world.
Just make sure you have dumbass exclusions in your policy so that when you do something bad, even knowingly, they go, "Here's your check."
If you're a really big company, you can do that.
That's how it works.
You can do that.
Both of those things are changing as the cyber insurance market matures, right? They are bringing on technologists. They are doing forensics. They're hiring third parties. A lot of the bigger insurance companies have a team in-house to do it, and they are working closely on actuarial tables. So the problems that you described may very well exist in the market now, but I think that they are changing as the market grows and expands.
So the moral of the story is have cyber insurance.
That's it. That's all y'all are getting. Richard gets the last word in this
And roll the dice.
All right, I'm going to zoom you guys out to I guess, a little bit more of a conceptual plane here. During Apple versus FBI, the sort of tension in between security and technical security and national security was front page news. And it led us to this idea that the framework of privacy versus security might not be the correct one, that it might be more of a security versus security conversation. Is that an accurate characterization, and is that tension insurmountable?
Yes, it is absolutely an accurate characterization of the encryption debate. As consumers, businesses, governments, we all depend upon strong encryption for our day-to-day communications and our business operations, proper functioning of government and the internet. But on the other hand, we should admit, it does pose particular problems for law enforcement and intelligence agencies, and we should not pretend that it doesn't. It is not insurmountable. There are ways to help, particularly frontline law enforcement, without blowing a giant hole through the foundational security of the internet. So we are very much against a backdoor into encryption, as well as the ability of government to force companies to write software to circumvent their own security protection measures, which will ultimately be something very similar. And two recommendations: one, government hacking. So government is already hacking, but there should be clear due process standards. There should be a I'd say a clear framework within which government can operate for hacking, because right now it's very nebulous. Mm-hmm. The second is looking at the legal contours of compelled password disclosure. And there are cases that are right now working their way through the system that address this very issue. The Fifth Amendment is very important. We want to protect the right against self-incrimination. However, the Fifth Amendment is not absolute, and there are different ways that government can ask for the password without violating the Fifth Amendment, without getting too wonky. And that particular issue, asking for passwords, is actually what frontline law enforcement faces most often. Right. It will not solve every problem, right? So transient communications between two nation states or a terrorist organization to a recruit, those transient communications are a different use case. They exist, it happens, it is a problem, but mostly what local law enforcement faces, the vast majority of these problems are they've arrested somebody, they have the device, they need to know what's on the device, or they want to know what's on the device as part of their evidence collection. And that is a solvable problem, I think, particularly if they need a warrant in order to look at the device, which generally speaking they do after a recent Supreme Court precedent. So those two things, government hacking and compelled password disclosure. One other point on government hacking, which is there are absolutely problems with it. I'm not an advocate for unbridled government hacking. Like I said, there does need to be a framework, but we should also embrace it because it is necessary, it's natural, it's going to happen, and our government does need to get better at it in order to both prevent negative externalities and combat cybercrime.
Well, it is happening. We're just looking to have more transparency around it. I mean, do you know who is the biggest buyer, or historically has been the biggest buyer of who's heard of 0 days? Raise your hands. Most of you, all right. So the concept of a 0 day is really typically it's the disclosure of a vulnerability, typically with an active exploit. Meaning you have something in software that's shown up, and then you have an exploit that can typically, oftentimes remotely, can take advantage of that vulnerability. So you have a 0 day. Does anyone know who, at least historically, has been the largest buyer of these things? There's a market for this. The Navy has historically been one of the largest buyers of these. Interesting, I don't know. Go Navy? Go Navy. But this is fascinating. Anyone here familiar? I won't ask you to raise your hands. I'll tell you what splunking is. You've heard of the product Splunk. Splunking. Splunking is a game where you go and you find caves. If you're a cave finder, this is what you do for your hobby. Typically, you would find that cave and you would keep it to yourself because you like your cave. And then you would go maybe share it with a few fellow splunkers. Hey, I've got this cave. It's very cool. And then maybe after a few years, you might make that cave available to the general public of those who care about those sorts of things. You would, open source your cave, I suppose. But this is a real thing. This is a great analogy for vulnerability disclosure. The people who find out typically about vulnerabilities are the bad guys first. It's economics, right? They all have these. You'd like to think it's our government that's typically the first ones to find these things. No, they're not. In the race condition, if you have a timeline, actually we're not usually the first. Yes, we're doing research, but we're not usually the first. I mean, there's this whole open source army called the world that's involved in doing this stuff. And so we have to be part of that economic scheme, so we are buying these things. But we're not the first. Right? So you have bad guys splunking away with their vulnerabilities. Eventually, somehow the government finds out through their spy work, what have you, maybe purchases them or what have you. And then maybe you find some firms who are doing pen testing who will buy those because they need to be successful when they're pen testing a bank, I don't know, whatever. Eventually, you have some sort of disclosure that goes to a company like a Microsoft or a Cisco. So I have a timeline here. You're watching the timeline? And then eventually, somewhere down the line, companies like mine or others find out about it. So think about this race condition that's going on. You, in particular you're after that, by the way, typically. It's a long, we're talking about years in most cases. Years, not a year, years. Is this whole reality that you need to be aware of. Again, this is why I go back to this whole concept of be risk managers, not control freaks. I just wanted to give you that story. I want to have you have things to walk away with. So there, now you know this. You know about 0 days. You know about the reality of the timeline. And now you know about the economics.
I think one point that's really important on the encryption debate is how pervasive encryption is. And I think this is oftentimes lost because it's generally been brought up in the context of Apple FBI is, the San Bernardino shooter and his iPhone, right? And so there was this sense, and it was very weird to watch, that it was like, oh, well, it's just this one time and it's okay. And then like the next day, the Attorney General of the city of New York is like, we actually have like 185 other phones we'd also like unlocked. So if you could do that too. And I'm sitting here like, well this was pretty obvious. But the actual output is underneath this, we've got phones as infrastructure, that's fine. But companies like Twilio are encrypting all of these communications, and you guys are processing millions a day. And then we have, I want to connect to my Amazon web server or my Facebook account or my bank. And so don't conceptualize this idea of there's crypto that works for my phone and then there's other crypto. This is an affront to mathematics. And that's the actual problem, is like we have math that tells us governing principles, and then we got this other stuff. And we can't focus on other stuff. We have to focus on the first order considerations. And that's why, Apple FBI was just so frustrating, and I worked with law enforcement for years. And to say that they have no other possible recourse or method for doing their investigation work is empirically not true, because they've been doing investigations since like the time of Charlemagne. And so, we had problems, of course, we've always had problems with privacy and security, security versus security, but really good law enforcement has always been able to come across that because they're great at doing investigations and being law enforcement officers. And they need assistance, yeah, but I think to blow away constitutional privileges is somewhat dangerous. And I got Ben Franklin on my side for that, so I'm pretty happy about it.
So one more thing, as a, making products in the private sector. My job as a CISO is to make products that are secure by design. We call it secure by design, default, and deploy. You'll hear this, SD3, but secure by design. Our job is to look at what we're trying to create. And you've maybe heard of privacy by design out of the EU as well. So there's privacy by design, secure by design. These are terms you'll hear. But we want to make products that are design, default, deploy. Here's an example of one that does that. This is, you may be familiar with the iPhone. iPhone is a recent example of implementing the SD3. We'd say from the metal on up, right, in terms of being able to validate identity of software that's loaded onto it, encryption, right, in transit, in motion, the whole thing, right? Apple did this. They didn't do it to be anti-government. They did it to be good citizens of the universe. By the way, breach is really expensive. Getting breached is very, very, very expensive. That's why we have cyber insurance. Lloyd's of London said that cyber insurance is the best thing since fire. So go. Yeah, exactly.
The insurance guy said insurance was great.
Yeah. But so, and they also said it's so catastrophic we can't handle it, but I'll still sell you a policy. So anyways, but you have an example here of that. And that's any CISO's job. That's our job. This is really healthy for the world, to make products that are not breachable. To also make products that are not then used as weapons. we don't want Twilio to be used as a weapon. We don't want this to be used as a weapon. So protecting you from breach, your identity, what have you, and protecting you also more generally from allowing our products to then be weaponized. This is what we do, but it's not a conflict with the federal government. This is what security is supposed to do.
Ron, I think you had something you wanted to add to this?
Sure, which is, I actually am skeptical that the United States Congress in particular is going to go back to the encryption debate and seriously talk about backdoor into encryption. You may hear talk about it, but I have trouble believing that legislation on this is going to move anytime in the near future. Where we may very well see it, and this is something to watch closely because I think it will have an impact on our companies. We may see it overseas. Several countries are already moving in the direction of weakening encryption in various ways. We've heard proposals coming out of places like Australia, Singapore, Vietnam. China is talking about it, of course, the United Kingdom. So if these developments actually come to fruition overseas, you may see companies want to play in these markets and have to comply with those laws, or you may see other services that arise and take the place and become the dominant service there. And you will start to see backdoors start to enter the marketplace in a way that they haven't currently because they are working with an overseas market, and that then might affect the security of those products here in the United States. So it's one thing to talk about the U.S. Congress, but we do need to pay attention to what's happening overseas on this issue as well.
While we're speaking domestically, though, let's talk about sort of part of where the U.S. government fits in here, which is when WannaCry and Petya sort of dominated headlines recently. Those are built on top of NSA toolkits, and they caused billions of dollars worth of damage, and they sort of sparked this call for more transparency in the process by which the U.S. government determines which vulnerabilities it's going to make public. But those vulnerabilities, the exploits and patches in those cases were already known, so there's a little bit of an irony in those two case studies. Should the U.S. government be doing more? Should they be making more of these vulnerabilities known?
Go back to my timeline and where you sit as a consumer and where the companies that you use sit on that timeline. We have to, again, be risk managers, not control freaks. If the NSA, which is here, bad guys are here, and all of a sudden they're going to go out and say, all right, totally exploitable, vulnerable thing, and it hasn't been effectively communicated to the Microsofts of the world, the Ciscos of the world, the Adobes of the world, Facebooks, the Toyotas of the world. Yeah. You've just created this race condition where it's going to be catastrophic, I think. So again, we have to be really thoughtful about what we mean about a control freak. Because a control freak may be very libertarian, I suppose, might say, yes, expose, just do that. And they've not been thoughtful about the realities. We need to be observers of the realities, and then, as you've said, be thoughtful about how we can come up with solutions that actually make sense. But it's on the backbone of crappy software that exists.
Yes.
And actually, well, yes and no, right? I mean, it's so I agree that there needs to be a process, right? Like there needs to be more transparency around it. Right now, there is a process. The vulnerabilities equities process exists, but it's not codified. It's not official. It's most of what the public knows about it came through a blog post written by the former cybersecurity coordinator Michael Daniel. Yeah. If I were the Trump administration, I would do this via executive order. In the absence of that, then we think that there should be legislation establishing this as a process. Then the big question, though, is what are the criteria that the government must use in order to decide whether to disclose? And what you're talking about mostly sounds like a rediscovery rate, right? So at what point do the vulnerabilities that the US government has, at what point are those being used by criminals or other nation states? And that is an extremely important criterion that we should be using to decide whether or not to disclose. And in fact, the government is. You mentioned in the question that the vulnerability that led to WannaCry and Petya, not Petya, that these things were disclosed actually to the companies. And the companies, Microsoft in this case, did issue a patch. The patch wasn't applied in many cases. And in some cases, it wasn't, my understanding is it wasn't just that they were ignored, it's that it's not just as easy as flipping a switch and patching, because those things do affect the interoperability of your other systems. And in some cases, these are like specialized legacy medical equipment systems and so forth. But it does put lives at risk when that doesn't happen. So if you're the US government, and this goes to the issue of criteria, and you know that there is a good chance that that what you disclose to the company is not actually going to be honored by the end user. Like the end user is not actually going to make the patch, and the thing is still going to ravage. Is that a factor? My understanding for WannaCry also was that originally was a targeted exploit right? It's like I want the government to be able to hack the Wi-Fi router of the leader of ISIS, right? But not the entire Middle East. And for WannaCry, it was originally a targeted exploit that the worm capability, what allowed it to spread so quickly, that was added by subsequent attackers. Is that also a criterion that the U.S. government has to think about? Every permutation of the vulnerabilities that they have, well, this could be turned into a mass hack, that causes worldwide damage instead of targeted damage. So it's actually very complex, and I think that just having the debate, agreeing that there should be a transparent and codified process is an important threshold that we need to get past. But after that, the criteria is what really matters. And we also have to become comfortable with the fact that not every vulnerability is going to get disclosed.
But I think there's a first order consideration which we need to address before we talk about vulnerabilities, which is creating better software, right? The reason why vulnerability exploitation is so easy for people of so little information capability is because we write terrible code. We write terrible code. Like human beings are not meant to be doing a lot of this development work, and it creates complications. And so we have these kind of three first order issues. The first one is we have to improve software security. We have to make it easier for developers to build securely. We have to make it a senseless, ridiculous observation to build insecurely. By your point of security by design, that's exactly what we need to be engendering. And I'll tell you, a frustration for me is over 10 years, we've only graduated about 285,000 computer scientists in America. Okay, we have 1.1, 1.8, depending on how you count, open cybersecurity jobs. And there's like only a couple of universities that are actually teaching secure programming. So this is a real problem. The second problem, though, is, so you've got your software problem. The second problem that's interrelated is there is almost no way to update and configuration manage or input policy-based management on so many devices that are used as attack surfaces for botnet attacks. And what's frustrating from my perspective is so many companies who claim that we prevent botnets, we solve botnets. Look at Arbor Network's latest marketing around this. We solve botnets. They don't. They make them chronic to live with, right? They sell you a shield, but they're not taking spear manufacturers offline. And this becomes problematic because now we have bad code, and secondly, we have code that can't really be updated easily. And so then when somebody comes along with a brute force attack that just runs sequentially or non-sequentially all the opportunistic numbers to break in using a basic standard password, right? It becomes so easy for mass exploitation, and there's almost nothing you can do about it except for throw it in the garbage. And this is actually what some people had to do. Axis Communications, which is the largest manufacturer of IP cameras, they had to issue guidance in some circumstances. It's not because of Axis, they're a wonderful company, but it's because of what it was built on top of. Their guidance was, in some circumstances, you have to throw the camera away. You have to put it in the garbage. Now that's a sunk cost investment for those companies. And these are not inexpensive, and they're purchased in the millions, which is why we had such a large volumetric attack coming off of a really small and seemingly insignificant attack surface, which was an IP camera.
So I strongly agree with is my mic on? Strongly agree with the need for better coding and better security from the design stage forward. I think that and that is foundational to cybersecurity, so absolutely, there's no argument there. But I would hesitate to characterize the vulnerabilities equities process, which is the U.S. government disclosing vulnerabilities to companies, as something that's very easy, right? Or that we're talking about widespread vulnerabilities that are easy to do. In a lot of cases, the vulnerabilities that we're talking about here are cost millions, if not billions of dollars to actually come up with, and a tremendous amount of expertise. If it is something that is very widely known and is very easy to execute, usually people already know about it. And the rediscovery rate that we talked about before, where other nation states or criminals, like they already know about it because it is very easy. And in that case, the government rarely needs to disclose it, at least through the VEP. Here we're talking more about exploits that are developed for law enforcement and intelligence, which are often orders of magnitude more sophisticated than something something as simple as phishing or lack of patching. Yeah.
Can I just say one thing real quick? Reminds me of the Imitation Game. By the way, if you haven't seen the movie, it's great. It's about Turing's life, Imitation Game. Go see it. There's this whole thing where they finally get their algorithm to work, right? And then they come up with the real risk management problem, When do we disclose whether or not a boat is going to be sunk or not? And then they start coming up with algorithms for disclosure. Really fascinating stuff, spy stuff. But I just think it's a great analogy. By the way, that is, in one sense, obviously, it's a little different. Well, actually, it's not that different.
It's not that different.
Yeah, I was gonna say.
So I don't know, I like that. When we practiced, I thought about that. wanted to get that out there. Imitation Game. Woo.
Great movie.
Great movie. All right, well, we've got about 5 minutes left before we're going to take some audience questions. So what I wanted to talk about before we get to the very end here is we talk a lot, and you've touched on this, Alex, in fact, you all kind of have today, about the dearth of technical knowledge in the federal government, especially when it comes to security. But there's not a lot of consensus about how to fix that. So I kind of want to get you guys going down the line and talking a little bit about your experience of connecting policymakers to coders. What does that look like? Harley, I'm going to let you go first. We're just going to go straight down the line.
So there's several levels to that question. One is whether or not we're talking about technical expertise as employees of the federal government versus the federal government or state governments, local governments, working with the security community that they don't necessarily employ. I'm going to focus on the latter. I'd say, number one, there is obviously a very deep cultural divide that needs to be bridged. There's distrust from the federal government towards the community. As I mentioned before, there is a perception, which is eroding, that all hackers are evil or somehow malicious. And again, that's changing. And then on the flip side, there's a perception from the security community that the government is out to get them somehow. I think that the numbers put that into question, actually. But that's a cultural divide that has to be bridged. There are both communities, government and the security, the InfoSec community, have forums that where people can come and interact. So government has very well established processes, right? So like if anytime that there's a rulemaking, there's a notice and comment process. There's all sorts of round tables and ways to interact with government where you can actually make a policy difference, where government is asking, hey, if you have expertise on this issue, please come and talk to us, give us your input. I think that a lot of the security community actually doesn't know about it. And on the flip side, government does not necessarily, in an organized way, attend the forums that the security community has available. You know, DEF CON and Black Hat are happening right now. But again, this is changing. I mean, there's a Meet the Feds panel. I know several federal employees that are actually going to DEF CON and Black Hat to change this. So I am optimistic about it. But I think that rule number one is to stop demonizing each other.
I always want to sing Meet the Mets whenever I hear Meet the Feds. It's terrible. It just sticks in your head for hours. Meet the Mets. No, you're not. Okay, it's fine. So the... yeah, that's it. That's all I got. Jokes are done. So I have... I'll take the first side of the question, because I wholeheartedly agree. I mean, it was really hard for me when I was, throughout government to work with the hacking community. And I got a lot of questions from my bosses, and I had to fill out a lot of forms, and it was very insulting. But the real frustration, I think, comes in the first side, which is how do we get more people in technology to work in government? So I'll pick on the Federal Communications Commission because we haven't done that yet. So at the FCC, I mean, we have under 30 people who know computer programming, and that should scare you. That should not oh, that's an interesting data point. You should be that's outrageous because they regulate the internet. And if they don't know how to code, then how can they really be expected to understand the intrinsic and inherent challenges in anything from what does reasonable network management constitute to how would you implement, a secure architecture and how would we enforce that? And so this becomes really problematic. And it's not just at the regulatory agencies. It's at almost every agency. And so one challenge is how do we make it easier for people to get into computer science and also into security, because they're not the same thing. And I would actually propose that one thing that you would want to do is start making security part of the required curriculum for just computer science and tech, and it's not. You can get an advanced degree in computer science and never one time have touched a security course, and this is really problematic. And then you go out in the world and you practice what is honestly tech malpractice by building something, asking people to use it, and not securing it. But the other piece of this equation is, well, shouldn't there be some sort of baseline requirements that if a organization like, we'll use the National Highway Transportation Safety Authority, because they're trying to require that all cars be connected over dedicated short-range communication by 2023, and if you look at the order, there's literally a placeholder, and it says placeholder for cybersecurity, right? They just went out and they issued public comment, which is great. That's what they're supposed to do. But like, how many security architects or security researchers do you think like maniacally read the Federal Register? Like, how many times have you read the Federal Register? It's literally the most boring publication on the face of the earth.
Don't ever say that to a regs reporter.
Yeah, sorry about that. Not sorry. But the outcome is, so now we have this circumstance in which we have organizations, departments, agencies that are trying to get us to do things and require us to do things, but they're not requiring them to be secure things. And this is where I think consumers need to start becoming a little frustrated, and members of Congress and tech reporters and others, I think, need to start asking important and serious questions of, did you validate that? Like, not do you have a bunch of computer scientists who are awesome, like do you have Bruce Schneier working for you or Dan Geer, right? But did you validate that with anybody is an important question. And I don't think it's enough to say we ran it past our contractors. I think there has to be a larger equities process for getting the security research community involved in policy. And if that doesn't start happening, we're going to see a lot of people who are going to be exploited. And they're not going to be the managing partner of a law firm who drives a Tesla. And they absolutely will be instead, you know, the single mom who uses a green dot card. And that's where this is going, and it's very frustrating.
So I think part of the answer is having people like ourselves here. I think this is great. My eyes have been opened in the past 48 hours since I've been here. I'm like such not a tech, not a tech wonk, I'm not a policy wonk. I realize there's so much education that I have to do to understand the concerns that you deal with. And I'm thankful for that opportunity, but I think also bringing you into our environment, maybe working with your organization to bring you, and I know we're talking about this, bringing TechFreedom to Twilio, to San Francisco, to really open it up. But, you know, I also think about what, this is not necessarily a Twilio advertisement, but we have 1.6 million developers and growing. It's probably 1.7 as of today, I don't know. But we're a communications company. We make it easy to communicate. We do this is what we do. And we're about doing good. If you look up the company, we do a lot of contribution to a lot of great causes. In many cases, using our communication platform, and not in a for-profit way. I'd like to think there might be, if we put our heads together, there might be something that we can do to help with this conversation, to scale it out, and find ways to make it easy to provide input into policy, to connect not just the developers, but the security community as well. So that's something that I'd be willing to explore further and see if there's something we can do to address that. But I think forums like this are fantastic. Get more people like myself to come and listen and speak, and then bring that back to their context. Bring you back physically, somehow.
Speaking of the people that are physically here, I think we are going to open this up to questions at this point. Do we have a mic, guys? Right over there.
Scott Cleveland, I'm not a cybersecurity maven, but make sure I heard what you were saying. Obviously, we have a big cybersecurity problem. You guys are experts. This is a huge industry. That's a premise. But what you said in the center is that we build bad code, and we don't have any way to update it easily. Now, 10 years after we knew we really had a bad, we know everybody's been stolen from on everything. How could it happen that we still don't write good code and that doesn't alarm people, and we don't have an easy way to update it? What it means is that we're falling farther and farther rapidly behind because we aren't even beginning to fix the problem at the base.
Yeah, so I want to clarify and address it, and then I want to kick it over to Richard. But so first thing is, we don't always build bad code, and not all code is not updatable. Okay, in the specific case of WannaCry and Petya and some of the more embedded systems exploits, that's actually not always easy to update and manage. Like, for example, if a company goes out of business, there's nobody to manage the code anymore, right? But it is actually still true that the vast preponderance of, even enterprise class devices have significant vulnerabilities. The problem is that what we've done architecturally is we've generally taken security and we put it over here, and then we had development and IT and we put it over here. And we have these two separate groups who are trying to address one function, and this creates a really bad working dynamic. But the other part is secure coding is incredibly hard. This is not a simple thing, right? Like, it can be as simple as like a fat-fingered error, like I put in a colon when I meant to put in a semicolon, right? That can add an escape opportunity for, it doesn't matter. But the output is, it's not simple, and humans make mistakes, and we have to compensate for that. And part of the problem is that there has been this incredible explosion in marketing that is, I think, honestly ravaging engineering and cybersecurity, because the incentive is to raise capital as fast as you can, right? Do a seed round, do an A round, do a B round, do a D round, try and exit, bam, you IPO, okay? That's like the whole thing that you see at RSA and these big trade shows. And what's frustrating is oftentimes they're copycat products, they're rushed to development, there's no or little requirement in their organization for software development lifecycle management, and there's no one enforcing any rules. And so you have to want to do this. And there are some companies that take a lot of responsibility and they do a great job. But then there are other companies. And there's no way for consumers to know, because once your code goes into the compiler, generally speaking, it's obfuscated, right? It becomes ones and zeros. And so it's not easily reviewable. And on that basis, we tend not to really know what's happening under the hood unless you work with products like Rapid7, unless you work with a bunch of other products to do software analysis. But they're not inexpensive, and nor should they be, because your company made a massive investment to develop a top-rate platform. And that can't just be free, but at the same time, you know, it's got to be more accessible. And I'd kick it over to you.
So to ground the assessment of we write bad code, the big perturbation, of course, was the advent of the internet, right? You had standalone devices that weren't designed for talking to one another, right? You had a console, you go up and you do something. Like medical devices are still very much this way, by the way. Actually, a lot of machinery is that way. But the internet came along, and most of you probably don't know who John Postel is, but he was the one who, at one point in time, he like ran the internet, okay? And so if you wanted an IP, what have you. John Postel had a law, Postel's law, that says be conservative in what you make, but be liberal in what you accept. I'll say that again because it's important, because it permeates software development networking. Be conservative in what you make, but be liberal in what you accept. A great example of liberality would be your browser. Your browser is essentially this thing that goes out and talks to a server and says, tell me what to do. Whatever your server are, and I'll do that, right? This is an example, an instantiation of that, but we have that kind of instantiation throughout. So you have this perturbation called the internet, and you have some theories about how you interact that were very, very liberal. The reality is no one realized that this is warfare. You're out there in a war environment. It should have been be conservative in what you make and be conservative in what you accept. And so we're having to recover from that. In 2002, Bill Gates, the Bill Gates email, you may or may not know about that. I'll summarize it. They do a lot of policy in email. The Bill Gates email went like this, summary. Oh shit. Okay, that was really what Bill said. And he really articulated this idea of secure and design. They are losing market share. A lot of vulnerabilities. Some of you were not born. You're very young, many of you. Some of you remember this, though. And what happened is he essentially articulated secure design. And the Trusted Computing Initiative started, right? You may be aware of that as well. And that's the whole process where Microsoft really went into a real long 12-step program. I've had the pleasure of presenting to a lot of CIOs. I've had one room full of roughly 1,000 of the Fortune CIOs, CTOs, and I asked them, how many of you are really doing, it was secure by design. How many of you are really doing it? And I said, be honest, be honest. And the CIO of Microsoft raised his hand, and then the CIO of Cisco was right beside him, and I think he felt embarrassed. He raised his hand as well. No one else did. Nobody else did this. They didn't have secure design. And so we're using things like Rapid7 to do cleanup. You know, the reality is if we actually started doing secure by design, it would decimate the security industry. Yeah. It would be awesome. Which would be great, yeah. It would be awesome. So we have some things that, we had this whole context that was standalone, that wasn't ready for connectivity, that was predicated, and then the internet and the connectivity was predicated on some philosophies or point of views, which were very liberal in the bad sense, right, of the word. And we've been recovering ever since. Oh shit, I'll say that again.
You wanted to add something to this as well?
Sure, so your question, we've been coding forever, everyone's been hacked, why aren't we better at coding? Well, you can say the same thing about cars, right? We've been driving cars for 150 years and our cars still break down, why? I mean, things have gotten considerably more complex. I think this is a problem that is going to stay with us for a very, very long time, as technology stays with us. When you think about like just coding in general, right? You have incredibly complex products that are then attached to other incredibly complex products, right? Your browser is attached to the internet. You get to the internet through your router, which goes through a system of tubes.
Series of tubes.
Sorry about that. Even and for very simple products or more simple products, right? IoT devices, it's not just the device, it's also the cloud app and the back-end system that it's attached to. And then there's the human factor. There's employees who click on phishing emails. I mean, it is very complex, and it is very difficult for any in-house security team, no matter how well-resourced, to catch everything. It just doesn't happen. For products like the simplest, like a connected light bulb or something like that, where is the incentive exactly to build, to put in the investment, because it is an investment into security, to build it securely, to patch it on a regular basis, to figure out the life cycle for patching and patch after the life cycle, or do what with it after that's done? I mean, if it's a light bulb, it doesn't cost very much. There's no regulation currently in the United States that requires the light bulb to be secure, and it actually will eat away at an already very thin profit margin. So I think that there are a lot of reasons why we have bad code. Do we need to get better at bad coding or get better at coding? Absolutely. But let's not, we also shouldn't say that this is not a problem that is not understandable, because in many cases, I think the complexity alone is what causes it.
Yeah, we've gotten pretty good at making medical devices that don't kill you. Of course, there's a shitload of regulation from a little thing called the FDA around that. Like, safety is very serious, right? And so if we can do it there, we could probably figure it out with software.
Seatbelts, what, 1968 for the seatbelt in a car? We were driving cars for 100 years before that.
I think we've got one more question over here.
Yes, thank you. Harley, you mentioned phishing attacks, which I'm glad you did, because an overwhelming majority of risks and breaches and loss actually comes from human error. Going back to Alex's point, humans aren't perfect. So to lay the blame completely at the feet of the code, I don't think is totally fair if most of the error is done by employees within an organization clicking on an email. So how do we address that more persistent and prevalent threat?
Well, but shouldn't your email help protect you? So I agree that there's a human error problem, but you're still interfacing with the system, right? And that system has a capability to detect and defend, and it doesn't. And so I'd beg the question of, so then are we using, is your email client an affectation of security by design or not? But you've got way more experience here.
Well, so phishing is just one way into a system, right? But then what happens when the attacker is in the system, right? So you phish an employee, the employee clicks on a link, well, what happens then? Well, then the attacker moves to the next phase and exploits a vulnerability within the system. So it does also end up being a code problem. If your specific question is, how do you address phishing? There are a variety of different ways. The best, but it's also occasionally inconvenient for anyone that is actually using it, is two-factor authentication. I use it. It actually really does help me feel better about the security of my email and Amazon and the rest of it. Not that it's impervious, but it's a lot better. Other ways are training, right? So employee training, teaching employees, to better distinguish phishing emails from emails that are not phishing. And then in the inevitable event, especially if it's a sophisticated spear phishing attack, that an employee does click on a link and it is phishing and the system does become compromised, then you move on to something more like vulnerability management, where they're trying to find that next phase in the attacker's attack.
One thing real quick, I'll make it fast. Browser, like I said, very permissive, right? But if your browser executes in a contained environment where that memory can't jump out of it, secure by design, game over.
Guys, we've got 2 minutes, and I want to try to get one more question in. I'm gonna go with this gentleman up here in the, nope, okay.
Harley, you touched on this. This follows up to the last question about cyber hygiene. And is government and industry's efforts adequate at this time to educate, the public, my mother, who has heard probably multi-factor authentication but doesn't really understand how that would really protect her and how to actually implement that? And what, not that we should advocate for more regulation, but is there something like, we get a prescription, there's certain instructions on that bag to make sure I don't kill myself when I take that pill. Would a label on that device when you purchase it to, instruct someone how to set up a more secure password or use authentication be helpful, or different ideas where government can maybe partner with industry. Your point about teaching security to graduate level courses. How about curriculum for middle school?
Yeah.
Teach kids how what is security there? What can government do a little bit more to partner with industry to sort of instruct the public at large?
So I think that government really is trying to educate the public at large about this. There's been a tremendous amount of headway. I think that cybersecurity awareness in government and in the public has actually risen considerably, like palpably, in the last 5 to 10 years. There are, of course, different audiences, right? Like a healthcare company is going to be very different than your mother. The types of attacks that they're facing, the resources that they can bring to bear, and also the expectation level for their security is going to be very different. My understanding is that government is trying to do it. I think that, arguably, the general public is going to be a lot harder to change their behavior. But that is actually, it seems like the goal of virtually every policy issue. In terms of whether there's a label, we support this idea in general, and there is in fact, many of you in the audience probably know this already, but the NTIA multi-stakeholder process, it's a mouthful, right? But on IoT updatability, and that actually just recently produced a guidance. This is very recent. This is like last week. Produced guidance to IoT manufacturers on labeling about updatability. So just a suggestion, it's completely voluntary, but suggesting that manufacturers put on communication, whether it's a box or whether it's like a digital description of a device in on Amazon or something like that, whether the device can actually be updated. How can it be updated and about for how long? Like, what's the anticipated timeline? If manufacturers just did that, and even just for IoT, I think that is actually a major progress in this direction. But then, to bring it back to the general public has to get used to looking for this and caring about it and knowing what it means. It is not a light lift, but it is happening.
It creates a floor, it creates a ceiling too. I'm actually kind of amused by this because I made that recommendation like 4 years ago, and it landed with a thud at NTIA at the time. But one of the outcomes, though, is if you give transparency and you require that manufacturers tell consumers what the choice is, then consumers have choice, and then they can vote with their dollars. And then instead of creating regulation, which is a floor, you create an opportunity for a ceiling. But you have to, I think it needs to be a requirement in certain classes of devices, not in all things, but in certain classes of devices that there is transparency to consumers. Because I don't know the developers who work at Medtronics, but they manufacture my mother's blood insulin meter. And I would like to know whether or not the blood insulin meter is secure. I assume that it is, but I have no way of verifying that, and I have no understanding or information rights over what I'm purchasing. And unless my mother, who's a wonderful person and a classically trained harpsichordist, uses her fingers to become a computer security expert, she won't actually be able to find out herself. And that's really problematic for consumer choice.
So I think we're getting into a world where, it's trust through transparency. I do think the consumer will reward those commercial entities that are able to demonstrate trust, and we will be increasingly competing on trust. I'm a firm believer on that. In fact, that's in part why I'm here. I think that we should have 2FA, two-factor authentication, or multi-factor authentication, as a default. Someone mentioned that to me recently, that I'm looking right at him, but that could be something that we have as a default. In fact, I just was at a senator's office where some of their staff was looking at some public metrics around 2FA, who is and who isn't using it, as a way to be transparent, and I suppose it's somewhat public shaming to encourage them to do that. My company offers 2FA, so obviously I'm a little biased here, but I think for grandma, she doesn't have to understand 2FA, it just needs to be there, right? Did you have to go through a training on terms of how to open, well, maybe for pills, maybe a little bit of training, but 2FA is pretty easy. Just there's to be a thing that says, did you really mean to do that? Click yes or no. Yes. Boom.
Cyber solved.
You're done. So I just think that we need but more defaults like that. So I think that would be great. And so there's some discussions that we'll be having more about how we can drive some transparency around some real low-hanging, very basic security fruit.
Guys, I'm going to have to cut us off there. We are out of time, but thank you so much for all of your interesting thoughts.